Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in for another video of mine. I'm not doing a used book rant today. I wanted to try something new. Literally. So today's book is The Tangleroot Palace. Just check out that beautiful artwork. It's written by Marjorie Liu. I bought this book at a place called Mysterious Galaxy in San Diego. I bought it while on vacation. I was spending New Year's learning how to make tamales and a couple other recipes from my mom's side of the family. And during the days when I wasn't cooking with her, I was exploring San Diego, found a nice little bookstore, and got a few books from there. It's been a kind of foray into more modern fantasy books through that one. If this video does well, or I feel confident about it, I may eventually do other modern fantasy and newer books I find. There's one called Leave Only Footprints that was a really fun read about national parks I may get around to eventually. There's Legends and Lattes, which I was surprised to find new on the shelves. That was a fun surprise as well. The Tangleroot Palace is a collection of 7 short stories written by Marjorie Liu. The introduction and the book in general has a little comment about each story and about the collection of stories. The introduction starts with, I started writing this introduction when the COVID-19 pandemic was just beginning to unfold. An early adopter of its seriousness, I was living in Japan, close to the epicenter, and it was strange and surreal watching the societal threads, what we take for granted, pull apart bit by bit. Now, months later, I've returned to finish this introduction, and while I'd like to say the intervening time has given me a new perspective around my work, the only shift for me has been a deeper understanding of the limits of human imagination, including mine. And it closes with, and so I say, if you're reading this and going through hard times, try to dwell in the possibility of a better tomorrow, no matter how impossible it seems. Ask the universe a question. See what happens. I hope. See, there it is again. I hope your adventure is beautiful. There's a few specific stories I'm going to discuss in this one, but I'll start by saying the reason I picked this up off the shelf was just this beautiful cover art. So the first story that I was really interested in and intrigued by is The Briar and the Rose. And this is a story about a woman that is an Amazon in a way. She is a swordswoman, prim, proper, defends her lady with the utmost of grace. But her lady is also a witch that is inhabiting the body of a beautiful young lady and using that young lady's body to gain political power and material wealth. The bodyguard is, as the story unfolds, trying to free this victim who she falls in love with. I couldn't help but fall in love with the whole story as something that I want to read a larger rendition of. Storytellers feature prominently in here how, in the attempt to defeat this witch, they go from storyteller to scribe to bard, anyone that might know how these old witches and old fantasy tales were defeated. The closing statement on this says, the theme of The Starlit Wood, the anthology where Briar and Rose first appeared, was simple, a fresh take on old fairy tales. Sleeping Beauty was already on my mind. The Disney remake, which focused on Maleficent, had only come out the year before, but the troublesome nature of the source material hadn't left me. The problem of the original Sleeping Beauty, called Sun, Moon, and Talia, written by Italian poet Giambattista Basile in 1634 is that ultimately it's a story about a woman who is far more attractive dead than she is alive. A woman who has little agency, who is forced into an unnatural sleep, raped while she is unconscious, and then, when she finally wakes, must go and marry the man who took advantage of her. It's a bleak story, but not an unfamiliar one. It's also one of my least favorite fairy tales, which is why I wanted to reinvent it as a tale about women, and the power of women, and how women save each other and themselves through sisterhood and love. As most women I know will tell you, they don't always sleep a lot, but they fight plenty. And when I was reading that closing statement by the author, what I thought of was the webcomic Megatokyo. Spoilers ahead for those of you that haven't read it before, but one of the characters that features prominently is what in the story is called a magical girl, effectively someone who stories are written around. That in that webcomic, these magical girl anime are kind of sustaining this woman's life, but as the comic goes on, her actual life isn't what is seen in the magical girl anime. Specifically, the story that the audience falls in love with, the audience of these magical girl anime fall in love with, is the part of her life as it was nearing its end, how she fell sick and then was dying and never had a chance to really live her life. It's not this character's actual history, though, and she says, she did live a life. She ran away from home, she fell in love, she lived her life until she came down with an unknown sickness, and the person she loved, a pirate, tried to get her some medical help, and in doing so paid the price. He was hanged. That story isn't explicitly like The Briar and the Rose, but the thought process at the end of, in that closing statement reminds me in a way that in a lot of these stories, the ailments, the illnesses, that's what people fall in love with. They don't fall in love with, or the story doesn't even revolve around the characters as they live, just the tragedy of life lost young. And in Sleeping Beauty, she ends up living a life, but not without having to go through that trauma even while asleep. And The Briar and the Rose really tries to reinvent that story while making it a very powerful and emotional lesbian romance. I loved it. It was a story that I want to read a full 300-page novel about. But it has its weaknesses, and I think it's a bit rushed, and you don't really get to see much of the conflict. It's kind of just the development of the romance and the relationship between the victim and the bodyguard matters far more in that short story than the conflict between the witch and the victim and the bodyguard. I think it could, if it were fleshed out longer, it would be more interesting, but as it sits right now, I like it. It's a fun story to read. It was 20 pages long and I loved it. The titular Tangleroot Palace, the short story at the end of the book, is about 50 pages, 60 pages long, and the closing statement reads, "Never After was the name of the anthology, and we were charged with telling stories about fairy tale weddings, but from a feminist standpoint." Well, I don't know anything about weddings, but I sure could imagine escaping from one. This also happens to be the third story in a row, seriously, I looked at the dates, where I was writing about magical forests with terrible, powerful secrets sleeping within. I don't know what was working through my unconscious during that time, but you, reader, are bearing witness to an imagination that was haunted by the spirits of trees. It's an interesting story. Tangleroot Palace, this short story, is about a girl that is betrothed to a person who has a terrible reputation, a womanizer, a murderer, a conqueror, all these sorts of negative traits attached to him. And the main character runs away. She is raised by her father because her mother died young, and she was kind of raised with a lot of freedom, and she uses that freedom to run away. The issue is that the romance side of things is kind of predictable and in a very not good tropey way. I saw the twist coming, and it didn't feel like it was a good twist. It felt like the twist is done in service of the theme of the anthology, fairy tale weddings, rather than what was in the best interest of the characters in the story. So it's a fun read, but it's kind of hard to reread that one. There's a bit of story involving, I think it's a witch that's imprisoned in this forest, and the certain hair color that the escaping princess has indicates her as one that is descended from the women that imprisoned this witch, this evil witch. But again, I don't think, like with the Briar and the Rose, this author does good conflict resolution, but the romances and the character writing is fun despite that. And that's kind of why I was so engaged with the story. Again, I don't like the way the relationship works out in the end, but while reading it, it is fun. The last short story that I really liked and kind of want to talk about is The Light and the Fury. It's set in an alternate history world where China expanded into the west coast of the US before Spain or England or America could really expand out there. And it also involves crystal skulls and like that supernatural-esque method of giving superpowers. But it's also the conflict between two women who used to be in a relationship and are now slugging it out. The main character is one that retired. She retired from the soldiering and heroing years before this story starts, but she doesn't like killing, she doesn't like the soldiering in general. But she's also a hero, an icon for the Chinese colonials and the Chinese family and people in the mainland. It's a fun story. It looks like one that could be a fun short film or movie to watch, but as a book it just doesn't really interest me for being so short as it is. Again, it's a really dumb complaint. I know this is an anthology, a collection of short stories, but they all seem like they're bigger than the story that we get. It feels like they were written to be 50 to 100 pages long and then condensed and trimmed so hard that it's not boring, but disappointing maybe, that the stories aren't as long as they feel they should be. So, I love this book. The artwork was really fun. The stories are engaging, interesting, charming, but they all felt over too soon. They feel like they come to their conclusion well before their time. I do actually want to read some of these other books by Marjorie Liu, some of these other stories, these graphic novels. I liked what I read of hers so far. I bought this book for $17 at Mysterious Galaxy. It was a really fun independent bookstore in San Diego. I got a lot of books from there. I still haven't read all of them. I'm really hoping to return to them again if I'm ever in the San Diego area. Thank you for tuning in to a different kind of video, a new book rant, I guess I'll call it. Thank you for tuning in to this new book rant. My name is Wildstag, and I hope you tune in for more.